The snow had fallen so quietly, it seemed to hush the very world. No birds. No wind. Just the slow sound of breath in the cold, white morning, and the crunch of thin, worn boots struggling to hold a woman upright. Rosie's lips were chapped, cracked red along the middle. Her shawl, once the color of earth, now hung stiff with frost, wrapped tightly around the shoulders of two small boys clinging to her sides. She walked slightly ahead of them, barefoot now, the left boot lost to a frozen stream 2 days back. Each step stung like fire, but she didn't falter. "Just one more rise," she whispered to no one, to herself, to the silence. Behind her, Eli, 6 years old, tall for his age, kept Toby's mittenless hand clutched in his. The 4-year-old made no sound, just blinked slowly as snowflakes caught in his lashes. They'd had no food since yesterday. A half-gnawed turnip, stolen when the storekeeper had turned to spit. Rosie had cried after, not from shame, but from the way Toby had said, "Thank you," with such soft gratitude it had broken her. A child shouldn't thank someone for stealing. The forest was close now. Pines creaked under heavy coats of white. Somewhere in the distance, a plume of smoke curled skyward. She followed it. She had nothing else to follow. As they crested a low hill, the boys stumbled. Rosie turned, eyes wide, heart pinched, and gathered them to her side. "Not far," she whispered, rubbing their arms. Her hands were trembling. She pressed her lips to Eli's forehead. Hot. Fever. And Toby's cheeks were too pale. Then she saw him. He was sitting by a fire beneath a rock ledge, legs crossed, back against stone. Shirtless in the snow, unshivering. A bear of a man, skin copper-toned and marked with quiet scars, long black hair draped behind him like a cloak. He didn't rise. He didn't speak. Just watched her. Rosie paused. Every lesson she'd ever heard, about men, about savages, about desperate choices, shouted inside her. But all that noise was drowned out by one thing. Her children were dying. She stumbled down the slope. The boys didn't resist. They were too cold. Too hungry. She stepped slowly into the ring of warmth around the fire, and fell to her knees before the stranger. Her voice was barely a breath. "I'll be your wife, if you feed my sons." He didn't move. Didn't blink. His eyes were dark, not cruel, not soft, just still. As if measuring something not in her words, but in the way her spine stayed straight despite her fall. "I don't ask for myself," she said. "Just them." Her fingers brushed the snow. They were blue. The wind caught her hair, yanking loose strands across her cheek like punishment. But she kept her gaze steady. The man stood. He was tall enough to make the mountains seem smaller. Silent as smoke, he reached out. Not to her, but to Eli. He lifted the boy as gently as a mother might, then Toby, cradled both against his bare chest. Then he turned and walked toward a shadow in the rock. A narrow cabin, half dug into the hill. Rosie staggered after him, barefoot, breath-catching. Inside was warmth. A fire already burning in a central pit. Heavy furs layered the floor. Hanging above the flame, a clay pot steamed with something rich and wild. Meat and root, maybe, maybe not. She blinked hard to keep from crying. He laid the boys down on fur. They didn't protest. Just leaned into it, eyes fluttering. Rosie collapsed beside them. The man dipped a ladle and filled a bowl. Wordless, he handed it to her. She didn't eat. She took the first spoon, and gently coaxed it into Eli's mouth. Then to Toby. When both had eaten enough to doze, she placed the bowl aside. Her own stomach howled, but she ignored it. She curled around them, wrapping the boys with her shawl. The man moved to the fire, knelt, and began sharpening a blade against stone. His silence wasn't cruel, it was complete. Not heavy, not cold. Like the silence before a snowfall. Not absence, but reverence. "I'll work," Rosie said softly. "I'll clean. I'll do anything. I won't be a burden." He looked over. His eyes landed on her, then drifted to the children. He nodded once. Rosie leaned back, her body trembling now that warmth had returned. Her fingers reached for the edge of a buffalo hide, and pulled it up over the boys. Outside, the storm whispered against the door. The fire snapped. Her breath slowed. This wasn't salvation. Not yet. But it was pause. Shelter. For the first time in days, she let her eyes close. And the last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the sound of wood being added to the fire. Not dropped, but placed, like a prayer. Tomorrow would still come. Hunger might too. But tonight, in the cabin of a stranger, beneath the snow-laced sky, a mother had asked for mercy. And mercy had stood up without a word. The snow outside had softened into silence, a hush that filled every space between the trees and blanketed the cabin in stillness. Morning crept in through the chinks of the wooden walls, a pale silver light brushing across Rosie's cheek as she stirred beneath the weight of the buffalo hide. Her arms tightened around her sons, both still sleeping, their breath warm against her collarbone. She listened for a moment. No wind, no cries. Just the low crackle of the fire and the quiet rhythm of footsteps. He was already moving. The Apache man stood near the hearth, barebacked, long black braid falling straight down his spine. He poured water into a clay basin and washed his hands like he did each morning, his movements deliberate, ritual-like. The blade he'd been sharpening the night before rested nearby, clean now, gleaming faintly. Rosie rose carefully, not wanting to wake the boys. She pulled her shawl close and moved toward the basin, brushing the sleep from her face with trembling fingers. "I can fetch more water today," she murmured, voice rough from disuse. The man didn't answer at first. He handed her a strip of dried meat and a warm flat cake wrapped in cloth. She blinked, surprised, but took them with gratitude. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but again, she saved most for Eli and Toby. The boys woke slowly. Eli sat up first, rubbed his eyes and smiled when he saw the food. Toby just curled deeper into the blanket until Rosie stroked his back. They ate together by the fire, their cheeks regaining a touch of color. The boys laughed, soft, unsure laughter at first. When Cove handed Eli a carved stick to poke the fire, the boy giggled outright. The man watched, unreadable. Rosie turned toward him. "They're feeling better today. Thank you." Still no reply. She cleared her throat. "Do you have a name?" He looked at her, then at the boys, then back to the fire. After a moment, he said simply, "Names are earned." Rosie felt herself blush, embarrassed for asking. She looked down at her lap, then whispered, "What do I call you then?" His gaze rested on Eli. "Whatever they choose." Later that morning, Rosie stepped out into the cold, her feet wrapped in cloth and twine. She walked down to the stream with a bucket and returned with water. When she slipped on the incline, he was there, sudden as a shadow, catching her elbow before she fell. She met his eyes. There was no mockery there. Only quiet steadiness. Inside the cabin, she began to clean, humming softly. The space was sparse: stone fireplace, deer pelts, shelves of dried roots, a folded blanket with careful stitching, but well kept. Every item had a place, and she respected that. She dusted gently, stitched a torn edge of cloth, and refolded what the wind had loosened. In the afternoon, Cove took the boys outside, showing them how to spot hair tracks in the snow. Eli beamed when he found some. Toby laughed when a squirrel startled from the woodpile. Rosie watched from the doorway. The wind tugged at her hair, and her eyes burned. She was still a woman who'd begged. She couldn't forget that. But her sons were laughing. And the man hadn't touched her. Not once. Not even when she'd offered herself like currency. That night, she made a stew with roots and dried meat, mimicking the way he'd done it before. When she handed him a bowl, his eyes lingered on hers for a second longer than before. Toby crawled into her lap after supper. "Mama," he whispered, "is he our papa now?" Rosie stiffened. Eli looked up too, holding one of the little carved sticks. "He makes fires like papa did. But he don't yell." Rosie swallowed hard. "He's helping us. Be kind to him." Eli nodded solemnly. "I want to call him Giant." Toby giggled. "No. Fireman." Rosie smiled despite herself. "Maybe both." That night when the boys had curled into sleep, Rosie turned to him where he sat near the fire, whittling again. "I don't know why you're helping us." He didn't look up. "Because you asked." Her heart stung at the simplicity of it. I didn't expect kindness. He stopped carving. Laid the blade down gently. They think you're their father, she said, barely above a whisper. His voice, when it came, was low but certain. Then I must behave like one. The fire crackled. Outside, the night pressed against the cabin walls. Rosie stared at the flame, tears pricking behind her eyes. I was a preacher's wife, she murmured. In a little church near Sand Hollow. My husband died in the fever last year. Folks said it was judgment. They turned cold fast. His brother tried to. She didn't finish. Just shook her head. So I left. She expected him to flinch at her shame. But he only reached for the firewood and added another log. She studied his face in the flicker light. There were lines near his mouth, deep ones. The kind carved by silence and restraint. I won't shame you, she whispered. He looked at her finally. I carry no shame. She held that thought deep in her chest as she pulled the covers over her boys. Toby stirred, then nestled against her. Eli mumbled something about rabbits and drifted off again. She lay there long after they slept, staring at the ceiling, the rafters above catching flickers of gold from the firelight. He hadn't asked her name either. The next morning, when Rosie stepped outside to shake out the blankets, she saw the tracks again, near the edge of the woods. Boot prints. Not his. Not hers. Her heart seized. She crouched, examined them. Fresh. Heavy. One man, maybe two. Watching. Waiting. She looked toward the trees. Someone was here, she told him later after breakfast, when the boys were chasing each other with snowballs. He glanced out the window, then opened a carved box from beneath the floorboards. Inside lay a rifle. He checked it with practiced hands. She watched in silence. Is it the town? She asked. His mouth tightened. The mountain doesn't forget. That night, Rosie sat beside the fire, knees drawn close, thinking of names, of who she'd been and who she'd offered to become. He sat across from her, quiet again, sharpening the same blade with the same stone. Do you have children? She asked gently. He shook his head. Family? They're not near, he said. She watched him a while longer. Then whispered, Can I call you Cove? His fingers paused. Just for a moment. Then he nodded. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft as breath. Inside, warmth glowed from the hearth, and 3 hearts began to beat toward something they didn't yet have a name for. The trail into town was half-frozen mud, crusted with snow and worn by wagon wheels long gone. Rosie walked beside Cove in the hush of morning, her feet wrapped in new deerskin moccasins he'd made. The boys nestled close on a small wooden sled Cove had pulled behind them. Their breath fogged the cold air, and the sun hovered pale behind drifting cloud. This was the first time she had returned since leaving, since shame had driven her from its doors. She remembered every boardwalk, every squeaking shutter, every pair of eyes that had turned away when she'd begged for help with a dying child in her arms. Cove said nothing as they approached. He moved with a slow, steady gait, neither proud nor fearful, only present. His silence made her feel steadier than any words might have. Like stone at her side. The first face they saw was Mrs. Lark's. She stood behind the shop window, her eyes softening only slightly before she ducked out of sight. The second was harsher, Miss Hargreaves. Broad-shouldered, thick-jawed, a widow twice over who had made bitterness her inheritance. She narrowed her eyes and stepped off the porch of the dry goods store like a hawk watching mice. Well, she said loudly, what's this now? Rosie looked away. But Eli, brave and bright-eyed, looked right at the woman and said, This is my family. Miss Hargreaves blinked, stunned. Cove nodded once and pushed open the store's door. The warmth inside hit hard, stove-heated and smelling of flour, leather and tobacco. Rosie guided the boys to a corner while Cove approached the counter. Sheriff Grayson leaned on the far wall, arms folded, eyes unreadable. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched when Cove placed a bundle of pelts on the counter. Trade, Cove said. The shopkeeper, a man named Hal, skittish and aging, nodded fast. Yes, sir. Good trade. Elk hide that? Fine piece. Cove said nothing more. Rosie picked up a bar of lye soap, paused, then chose a length of coarse wool. Hal glanced at her, then back at Cove. "Yours?" he asked awkwardly. Rosie straightened. "I'm his wife." Miss Hargreaves gave a soft snort near the door. The sheriff finally pushed off the wall and walked over. "Rosalie Miller, isn't it?" he said, voice dry but not unkind. She turned to him. "It is. Thought you left these parts." "I did." His gaze shifted to Cove. "You're back with an Apache now?" Rosie didn't flinch. "I'm back feeding my sons." Cove met the sheriff's stare without hostility. "Only wait." The sheriff rubbed his temple. "I don't want trouble." "We don't bring it," Rosie replied. He looked like he might say more, but just tipped his hat and left. Outside, the town buzzed. By the time they reached the blacksmith's, the story had already moved ahead of them. That Rosie was living in sin. That the boys were calling a savage father. That she'd sold herself like chattel. Mrs. Lark, quiet and kind-eyed, caught Rosie's hand near the well. She said nothing, just pressed something into her palm. A pair of wool socks for the boys. Rosie's eyes burned. She whispered, "Thank you," and the woman nodded without meeting her gaze. Eli tugged at Cove's pant leg near the livery. "Can we ride the pony?" The blacksmith, a round man named Dobbs, looked ready to shoo them away until he saw Cove watching him. Then he muttered, "Just don't let him spook the mare." Cove lifted Eli gently onto the saddle. Rosie saw the way passers-by stared, some with curiosity, others with outright disdain. A voice rose behind them. "She's in his bed now. That's not mercy. That's disgrace." Miss Hargreaves again, whispering loudly to a woman near the millinery. Rosie turned slowly. Her face burned, but she kept her tone calm. "You speak as if you know mercy," she said. "But you never offered it." Miss Hargreaves opened her mouth, but Rosie walked away before she could answer. By noon, they'd finished the trading. Flour, sugar, nails, salt, soap, socks, thread, and one small peppermint stick for each of the boys, paid for in silence and hide. As they left town, the wind picked up, and the air turned sharper. Eli nestled into the sled beside Toby and whispered, "I like when we go with him." Rosie glanced back at the storefronts. The faces had vanished behind windows. But the words still clung. On the trail home, she finally asked him, "Why help me?" Cove didn't turn. "You looked me in the eye when you begged." "I offered myself," she said bitterly. He stopped walking. "You offered your name first," he said. "That's more than most." She watched him then, really watched him. Not as a savior or a mystery, or even a man who'd taken her in, but as someone bearing a weight she couldn't name. They reached the cabin just before nightfall. Snow was starting again, soft and slow. Rosie carried the boys inside while Cove began chopping wood. She knelt near the hearth, feeding logs into the fire, her hands steady now. "Eli wants to call you Pa," she said softly as Cove stepped inside. He hung his coat and crouched by the fire. "If he wishes." Rosie nodded. Her lips pressed together, her throat thick. "Do you mind?" "No. Do you want that?" she asked, not as a bargain this time, but as a woman learning how to ask for things gently. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "When I buried my father, I lit the fire in our lodge and kept it going for 7 days. After that, the house was empty." She didn't understand fully, but she understood enough. That he had known absence. That her children's laughter meant more to him than he'd show. That night, Rosie sat outside the cabin beneath the overhang while the boys slept. Cove came to sit beside her. "They won't stop talking," she said, smiling faintly. "All the things I've done wrong. All the things I should have done. But none of them fed us. None of them carried my child through the snow." He said nothing, but his presence beside her spoke volumes. "Do you ever regret helping me?" she asked quietly. He looked out at the trees. "I regret not helping sooner." Snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in quiet. Rosie sat close enough to feel the warmth of him without touching. It was enough. For now. The eyes of the town would always find something to judge. But here, between firelight and falling snow, she was building something those eyes couldn't see. Not yet. And in her chest, something fragile began to thaw. Toby's cough started in the middle of the night. Short, dry, but sharp enough to sit Rosie upright by the hearth. At first, she told herself it was nothing. The kind of cough boys get after rolling in snow or sleeping too close to a draft. But by dawn, his skin had turned pale and waxy, his forehead hot to the touch. He wasn't moving much, only mumbling in half-sleep. She tried everything she knew: cooled cloths, warm broth, whispered prayers. Eli stood nearby, watching her with wide eyes and clenched fists, too young to help, too old not to know this was bad. Cove returned from the woods, snow crusted on his shoulders, a hair in one hand and a bundle of gathered bark in the other. The moment he stepped inside, he knew. Rosie met him with her breath half-held. "He's burning." Cove didn't ask questions. He dropped the hair, knelt beside the boy, placed a steady palm to his chest, and then to his forehead. For the first time, Rosie saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern, maybe even fear, though it passed so quickly she doubted herself. "What do we do?" she whispered. He stood. "You keep the fire burning. Don't let the warmth die." He moved like a man with purpose now, pulling out jars and wrapped bundles from beneath the floorboards. He began grinding dried roots into powder, mixing them with snowmelt over the fire, stirring until the scent changed. Pungent, earthy, almost bitter. Rosie sat beside Toby, singing low to him, voice hoarse. "You are my little one, my small brave thing." The boy whimpered. His lips were cracked and his body curled like he was trying to become smaller, trying to hide from the ache. When Cove handed her the small clay cup, she didn't hesitate. She cradled Toby and poured it gently down his throat in sips. He gagged once, then swallowed. Then he slept. The fire popped loudly. "How did you know what to give him?" she asked. Cove was cleaning the pestle with deliberate motions. "My mother nursed warriors through frost fever." "You never told me. You never asked." She wanted to speak, to fill the air with something. Gratitude, apology, anything. But the weight of the moment hushed her. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beside Toby, feeding the fire, whispering his name. Cove sat near the door, his blade across his lap, as if expecting something outside to come knocking. Morning was no brighter than night had been. A heavy sky pressed against the mountains, and the cold felt sharper, like it was chewing its way beneath the doorframe. Toby stirred at midday. His lips moved. "Mama." Rosie's breath caught. "I'm here. Hurts less." She pressed her forehead to his. "You're so strong, my sweet boy." He reached out a tiny hand, weak and shaking. She held it like it was the last warm thing in the world. Later, after he'd fallen asleep again, Cove stepped outside. She followed. The snow had stopped. Everything looked quiet, untouched. But she saw it immediately, the tracks. Boot prints. 2 sets. Heading toward the cabin and circling back. "Someone's watching us," she said. Cove nodded. "Same as before." She felt her stomach twist. "The town?" "Maybe." "Then why not go to them? Ask the sheriff to help." His expression didn't change. "They won't protect you. They'll only watch." She swallowed. "Because I'm with you?" "Because you shamed them when you survived without them." The truth of it hit like ice in the lungs. She looked at him then, really looked. This man who had asked for nothing, taken nothing, yet stood guard as if this little family was his entire world. "I said I'd be your wife if you fed my sons," she murmured. "But that's not why I'm still here." His eyes searched hers, dark and steady. "I see you," she said, voice trembling. "And what you've done for us. No one's ever done that. Not even when I was married." Cove didn't speak. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Then he reached for her hands, just held them. Not possessive. Not hungry. Just holding. They stood in the snow, hands entwined, firelight flickering behind them. That night, Toby slept soundly. Eli did too, curled against the wall with the peppermint stick still in his pocket. Rosie sat beside the fire. Cove was across from her, sharpening an arrowhead. "I meant what I said," she whispered. He glanced up. "I want to be your wife. Not for food. Not for a roof. But because I trust you." He put the stone down slowly. The silence between them was full of breath, full of something old and tender, like water finding its way to the root. He didn't say yes. He simply walked to the hearth, took a heavy buffalo hide, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he sat beside her, so close their knees touched. "This is the place I will build," he said. "So no one can ever take it from you again." It wasn't a proposal. It was a vow. The next day, they packed what little they had and hitched the sled. The storm had broken, but the sky threatened more. Cove led them deeper into the hills, beyond the old trails, to a clearing nestled beside a rock wall and a half-frozen spring. "This will be home," he said. Rosie looked at the space, rough and raw, nothing but snow and stone, and saw everything she needed. They set to work. Cove began to cut trees. Rosie made a fire pit. Eli helped dig. Even Toby, weak but smiling, handed over twigs. They slept that night under a lean-to of branches and wool. But there was laughter in the cold. There was the smell of stew again. There was hope. But the next morning, smoke was rising, not theirs. Rosie stood on the ridge and saw it in the distance. Their old cabin was burning. She dropped to her knees. Cove came up beside her, quiet. "Someone did that," she said. "They waited until we left." Cove's jaw tightened. She turned to him. "They'll keep coming." "I know. What do we do?" He looked out over the land they now called theirs. "We build something stronger. Before the fire goes out." And as they walked back to the half-made shelter, Rosie didn't look back at the past. Not anymore. Because everything she truly wanted had already begun to rise from the snow. The logs were heavier than Rosie remembered trees could be, but she carried them one by one with frozen hands and burning purpose. Cove didn't stop her. He only matched her pace, never offering to take what she carried, but always watching, always near. That, more than any words, made her feel partnered. By the end of the second week, the walls stood knee-high. The boys dragged stones for the hearth, piling them proudly. Cove carved grooves for timber joints, his bare hands blistered but sure. Rosie sewed canvas from old sacks to serve as a temporary roof. At night, they huddled together under patched wool while snow tried to pry them apart. This home, rising from the bones of wilderness, was not just shelter. It was defiance. It was belonging. It was hunger made visible. Hunger for peace, for warmth, for a life not borrowed or pitted. On the third day of clear skies, Cove handed Eli a small wooden mallet. "Strike here," he instructed, guiding the boy's hand to a peg. Rosie watched her son's face stretch with pride. "Mama, we're real builders now," he grinned. She smiled, tears stinging. "Yes, sweetheart. You are." Toby, now healthier, laughed as he chased a chicken that Cove had traded for in the last trip to town. That day Mrs. Lark had quietly handed him a linen bundle with soap, dried apples, and 3 sets of thick wool socks, one of them sewn by hand. Cove had accepted it with a nod. He'd returned without saying a word of it, only laying the items near the fire where Rosie would find them. That night, she touched his arm as they sat outside under the stars. "You built this from nothing." He shook his head. "We built this from hunger." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Still, it's beautiful." By the 4th week, the cabin had a door. No lock, just a thick beam to slide across the frame. Cove carved marks into its edge, symbols from his childhood. When Rosie asked what they meant, he said quietly, "It means this place belongs to the living." But not everyone wanted them to live in peace. On the 5th morning, they found a rifle round buried in the doorway. No sound in the night. No footsteps. Just the bullet, like a whisper of warning. Rosie didn't cry. She held the round in her palm, looked at Cove and said, "They want us afraid." He took it from her hand. "We won't be." That day, Cove placed tall stones in a circle around the cabin's edge. Not as defense, but as presence. Markers. Memory. Rosie helped, even though her fingers bled from lifting granite. Each rock placed felt like telling the earth, "We are here. We belong." Then came the coldest night of the season. A wind so sharp it cracked branches like bones and scattered coals from the hearth. The cabin shook in its seams. Rosie held the boys close beneath the thickest firs. Cove stayed near the fire, feeding it slowly, keeping it alive with the same reverence one gives to a sleeping child. In the dark, Rosie whispered, "I don't want to survive anymore. I want to live." He turned toward her, face lit gold by flame. "Then let's begin." The next morning, as if summoned by her wish, he handed her something small and folded. His mother's necklace, made from riverstone and deer sinew. She looked down at it, then up at him, breath caught in her throat. "I want you to wear it," he said. "Why?" "Because my mother wore it when she gave life. And you brought life back." Rosie's fingers trembled as she tied it around her neck. It was nothing like a wedding ring. And yet it felt more sacred than any gold band ever had. The boys ran in circles outside, shouting, "We have a house! We have a house!" And just like that, it was true. The walls stood tall. The roof, patched with cedar and hide, no longer leaked. The hearth glowed steady. There were shelves now, carved from salvaged wood. And 2 beds, one for the boys, one for her. Cove still slept near the fire, as he always had. That evening, as snow began to fall in quiet flakes, Rosie stepped outside in her cleanest dress, white cotton with faded blue thread. Her hair was brushed, pinned with 2 slivers of wood Cove had carved. She walked to him where he sat splitting logs. He looked up and stilled. "I said I'd be your wife if you fed my sons," she said, voice soft, shaking. "But now, I want to be your wife because you fed every part of me I thought had starved to death." He stood, towering, broad-shouldered and silent, snow melting in his hair. "I know I was given," she said, "like a broken coin. But I want to give myself freely now. To you." He stepped forward and did not speak. Just lifted her, one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and carried her into the cabin. Eli clapped. Toby giggled. Cove set her down before the fire, knelt beside her, and reached for something carved from wood. A ring, imperfect and warm in the hand. "I don't have a preacher," he said. "Or papers. Just this." She cried then, quietly, so the boys wouldn't worry. He slid the ring onto her finger. "Wife," he whispered. That night, the boys curled into bed, exhausted from joy. Rosie sat beside Cove by the fire, her hand in his, the necklace cool against her chest. She looked at the home they'd built. Not from wealth, not from permission, but from hunger. From hunger for safety. For love. For something that would last longer than fear. Outside, wind pressed gently at the windows. But the fire held. And if you ever find yourself walking through snow deeper than your knees, lost in a world that never fed you, look for a crooked chimney near the ridge. You might see a woman's shawl hanging on the line, or hear children laughing. That house was not given. It was earned. And it still burns warm. For those who know how to build from hunger.